Green Spring. Today we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But first, before we interview two of our very own residents that were at the event, we'd like to take a video and a look at the event firsthand. So let's go to that and we'll be right back.
To join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
And welcome back, Green Spring. I hope you're having a great day. And today we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which occurred here in our nation's capital. Today we're going to be interviewing two of our very own Green Spring residents, Lucelia Woodard and Mabel Thornton. And I just wanted to, get an idea of, you were both at the event yourselves, and the reasoning of why you both went and how it impacted you, and just in general, what was the atmosphere like having been there in person?
Well, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to travel from New York City, where I lived, to the march on Washington. It was my very first visit to Washington, D.C., and because I had been employed by the church, the Episcopal Church, I had had a sense of the church's involvement in the civil rights movement on the side of justice and freedom for people of all colors. Coming to Washington was an amazing experience, one that impacted me personally because I had not lived under the segregation laws in the United States. I grew up in the Dominican Republic in a society that valued education and the commonality of the human human beings rather than the color of one's skin. And so I felt that that was an experience that I would never forget, and I haven't forgotten it. And I'm grateful that I was there.
It's very, very interesting. So you were living in New York at the time of your...
I had been a recent arrival. I had been in New York for a year. And not accustomed to the treatment of people of color in this country.
Right. So one of my questions would be then the process of but making the trek from New York to here in Washington, D.C., did you notice anything? Just the transportation, I guess, is one of my main questions.
Oh, yes. We came by chartered bus. And as you now know, the buses in numbers were just staggering. And entering the city, my recollection is that residents standing on their balconies and their doorways looking on seemed very, very concerned. In their facial expressions, I could see that there was something that people were concerned about, possibly afraid of, but I didn't understand why.
Right.
And so it was one of the things that I had seared in my brain, that was eventually in reading the newspapers, that it was fear that had pervaded the society, both sides.
And Mabel?
Yes, I went to the march, and I'd say it was mainly because I had a sister coming down from New York. But then as I began to think about it, and I was in the service yesterday, and Reverend Bell and Reverend Kraft was telling us we've got to tell the story. So it's a long story why I was at the march. I was born and raised down in Virginia in the little county called Amelia, Virginia, about 130 miles from here. And I was one of 11 children, 10 of 11 children. And there were no schools for blacks in that county until the late 30s or mid-30s. So my older sister, two of my older sisters had been sent to New York to try to get an education. And one, it didn't turn out well. She came back home with tuberculosis. This sister, Martha, was still in New York. And she had told me she was coming down on the bus. And I said, well, if she's coming, I must go. In the meantime, I had two brothers who had been in the Navy and could tell a lot of tales about that, but they were coming. One was president of the NAACP in Roanoke, Virginia. The other was a worker in organizing chapters in Southern Virginia. My father had been president of the NAACP in my county. So we had been steeped in the fact that we must advance as a people. And the treatment that we had received as far as education was concerned, lack of education, was something that lasted throughout our lives. Because only the last four of us were able to get high school education in Amelia County. And all four of those were able to go on to college. The others did not get a college education. And thank God all of us made it, because the other thing that helped us was the church. And we, during that time when I was in high school, we used to have classes in the church for how to vote and teaching people to vote. So all of these things were in me, but yet I wasn't going because the thing in Washington was saying, I was living in Washington, I'd been in Washington for 13 years, was saying, you know, it just might be a riot or trouble or whatnot.
Right.
And even though my church was encouraging us, the NAACP branch there was organizing, I had sort of decided I wasn't going until my sister said, oh, well, I'm coming. And of course, there's no way for me not to go with her coming down. And my other brothers, they came also. But it was a day of, you would almost say euphoria in being there among all these people. And we were lucky, we were blessed really, because we had had seats right down below the platform. Some other people from my church had gone, and we came across them, and they had brought folding chairs. Well, we were older than they were, and of course, our people that taught you, they gave us their seats. So my sister and I sat during the whole program right down below, down in the monument down there. And it just was, my brothers, one of them climbed trees, and they all came to my house afterwards, and we had just a great time. We could say hallelujah time, because it was, the feeling was so great of everything has gone so peacefully. Everyone's so kind to each other.
Right.
And that was my experience there. But, and I don't want to, you have to top me.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, exactly how you were saying, the atmosphere must have been unmatchable. And one of the things that I had been, you know, reading about previously was the FBI and the feelings that people regarded towards Dr. Martin Luther King after his speech. They said things such as he was going to now be one of the regarded as the most dangerous man in America. And I had a quote that I thought was just really powerful. We must mark him now, if we have not so done before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. So I wanted to ask how the atmosphere felt to you at the time that you were at the march, and then soon after, did you notice, you know, tension in society, and just how it felt in general afterwards as months passed?
My recollection of the atmosphere was, it was remarkable that, as we have heard, people were very kind to each other, supportive of each other, which means that I gather everybody was glad to be there, proud to be there, and knowing that history was being made. The fear that the FBI expressed later on about Dr. King's potential for trouble was fear. And fear is something that invades people who realize that the so-called opposition has a basis for speaking out, and courageously trying to lead people to a better future. That's my sense.
Very well put.
Yes. I think their fear came from the fact of how they were treating us. And I have two books here that show the type of racism that's that was in the country and still is. And this first one, I was recommended to it by a lady here, The Warmth of Other Suns. It's the epic of the story of America's Great Migration, written by Isabella Wilkerson. And she tells the story of, she did a lot of research. She had gotten grants and whatnot. And so it's factual. And she tells the story in particular of 3 people who left the South and why they left the South. It was amazing. Some things I'd never heard of that was done to blacks in the South. And then when they got to the North, they weren't treated that much better in many senses in trying to find jobs. And here again, this march was for jobs and freedom. And how the immigrants from Europe in particular kept blacks from getting jobs they were always put in the lower group of jobs, if any job at all. They got shut out in many places in the United States. And this book was being discussed at the book club here. And this is a blessing to be here, because we do have most of the, I think, or many of the whites anyway, are, I won't say they are aware, but they're trying, some of them are trying to become aware, I'll put it that way. Because this was a Thursday, I think the Thursday evening book club was discussing this book. And in it tells about these towns, sundown towns. Sundown towns. I didn't say that right. Yes, sundown towns. These are towns in America where blacks were not allowed after dark. They could come in there and work, but they couldn't stay. And there are thousands of them. Now, this is a black lady who wrote this book, and she has very high credentials. This is a white man who wrote this one, and he has very high credentials. But he has thousands of towns listed in this book. And I haven't really read this one completely, but the reason I brought it up, because there was a lady there, and she said I could mention her name, Sarah Rhodes, and she's from Indiana. And she said when she heard that, she was just shocked. She had lived in Indiana a large part of her life and did not know about the treatment of blacks, and did not know that there were towns in Indiana, and there are hundreds of them in many states who did not allow blacks there after sundown. They come and work, but then they had to go. And this sign here is he has that on that book, showing that. And these kinds of things are what have kept the blacks down. And yet we have so many, I don't say so many, we have many whites who think that blacks are down because they don't want to work, or they're just lazy, or they don't do things right. But there's so much in the United States that we are not aware of that has happened to our people. And it is something I'm looking forward to reading it, as much as I hate to think about it, that our country has treated us so badly. So these are things that are still going on. And here's another one, because so many people think that it was all about the South and the segregation laws. But this is in yesterday's paper, and yesterday's paper would just have been a whole history lesson in itself. At home with slavery in the North. Now this is the picture of a plantation. This is the house, and it has been in this family lo these many years. The book is called The Manor, 3 Centuries at a Slave Plantation on Long Island, and it's written by Matt Wiswall. The family is still living there. And of course, New York and some of the northern states abolished slavery early. But at the same time, this family has kept this house and not all the land. They sold off some of the land. At one time, they had 8,000 acres, but it was a great plantation. And they had a Quaker background, but it mentioned the fact that he didn't let his Quaker background keep him from having slaves. So these are the things that are historical, that needs to be talked about.
Right. And I'm really interested in the point you made about the book Blacks Not Allowed After Dark, and that brings me back to the thought of the goal of the march. And we were speaking about it a little bit before the show, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what did you see the main goal of the march being, and was it to eliminate Jim Crow laws, something more than that? And if so, how did it handle that? How did the march
I think the focus of the march was for jobs. Jobs, and freedom. Freedom for people to move around, to come and go. Freedom for people to be able to vote. There are all kinds of ways in which people can be oppressed. And if you're oppressed, you're not free. If you can't go into a restaurant, if you cannot go into a supermarket. You cannot go in certain stores. That even not until so long ago, my own personal experience was I couldn't try on a hat in a store, in a department store. It was not allowed. So it was freedom to exist as a human being, a whole human being. And jobs is another form of freedom.
Right.
If you can work and make a living and sustain yourself, you don't have to be dependent on handouts, as people call them.
Right.
So that's my sense.
And my sister definitely was one of those concerned with jobs, even though she had gotten a good job at this point. But she was one of those who was in the strikes on 125th Avenue in New York back in the 30s, when, of course, the whites owned everything, but yet the blacks could not get any jobs in Harlem as such, at this portion of Harlem. And they went on a strike to be able to work in the stores. But I wanted to read here this portion of this article which tells the reason. It's the marchers demanded equal access to public accommodations, housing, education, and voting rights. But in an official list of demands, they also called on federal authorities to create meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages for unemployed workers and raise the minimum wage to a level that would give all Americans a decent standard of living. All Americans, black and white. And this is so very important that we should realize that it was black and white.
Right.
For many participants, the most important demand was the Federal Fair Employment Practice Act, banning government agents, private employers, union and contractors from discriminating against workers. Because I know you've heard the phrase, we were the last hired and the first fired. And this happened with the war industry when the defense factories in New Jersey, for instance, that's the one I knew about, wouldn't hire blacks. And then after they had, the men going off to war, they hired blacks. And then, of course, because of the government ruling, but then my sister, in fact, two sisters, were hired. But soon as the war was over, they were fired, of course. And they had to go back to the menial task, either working in service or some other task. But the act was passed, and Randolph, A. Philip Randolph, was really the person who organized the march. He had started to have one way back in 1941. And he and Bayon Rustin, I think, were the basic organizers of the march. Not taking anything away from Dr. King.
Right.
But, and so it was a large mass of people from all walks of life who were concerned and trying to make better conditions for blacks and all people in America.
So it's important to note, that's very important. The goal was for equality, not just of African Americans, but everyone.
Everyone.
And which brings me to my question today. After a lot of the events that have been going on recently and since the day the march occurred, how would Dr. King react to the situation today? How do you think he feels in regards to jobs, equality of African Americans and people in general, and just maybe any racial tension or anything that's been going on in society today as since then?
I wish I could read his mind. But I would think that he, like so many of us and so many people around the country, realize it's clear to see that much progress has been made. Much progress has been made in a great to a great extent, thanks to his leadership and the leadership of all of the people who worked with him 50 years ago and continue to this day in many cases to work. I think that he would be glad for the progress, but he would still be at work to make things better, because the dream has not been completely fulfilled. The check has not yet been paid in full.
Right.
And so I think that there's work to do, not just on the part of those leaders that are still working today, but all of us, of all races in this country, for the good of the country, not just one segment of society. And I think there's work to be done, and the hour is getting late, frankly.
Right. Certainly he would have more to hope for and look forward to. And
I think
agree.
so. Yeah.
I think he would be pleased at the progress of the desegregation, in the sense that the laws were changed. But as we said, there's still much to be done, and I think he'd be saying some of the same things he said back then in his book, Why We Can't Wait. And he talked about the fact that there are massive type of program need to be done for the poor, and especially the black poor, because of this debt that the country owes to American blacks who were kept in slavery for 2,000 years. And he said, just like you did the Marshall Plan for Europe after the war, and you spent all those millions of dollars, and just as you did the GI Bill of Rights, that there need to be a massive program done in order to bring those who were not able to really make the first step. Some of us were just blessed in that we had parents who seemingly had a natural ability in knowing how to mentor. And I think a lot of that, of course, I attribute to the church and to the fact that we believed in God. And we knew we were children of God, even though people were telling you, you're black, you're no good. See, that this is what, and the children of today have seen more of that than we did because of television. Our blacks look at television for long years, and they saw a black face, and only black faces you saw were somebody not doing anything. And that has done something to their mentality. So there need to be a massive program, he says, to find ways of putting them into mainstream. And as we know in our country now, in these last 20 years or more, the rich is getting richer, the poor is getting poorer. So they do not have the kind of hope that we had even when we came along. So I think Dr. King would be out there in front trying to get the people to understand that we can't wait much longer, because we are losing people, and we are having, because this is why we got so much violence in the black communities.
Right.
And yet the people who in our aid and whatnot are fighting to keep these guns. It's like in the district, they had a law that said that, these guns would not be legal, and Congress overruled it. So the people of the community are doing things hoping to be able to get rid of violence, but then the government will not pass the right kind of laws that will help them to do this.
And in connection with what you just said, one of the things that we discussed before the show was, what can church and other faith groups do to help fulfill Martin Luther King's dream? And I wanted to ask what your thoughts on that were.
Well, I wanted to tell you about the service at the village church yesterday. I was just so filled up, I felt almost like I did at the day of the march. Reverend Bell and Reverend Croft did this sermon using a passage from Isaiah about filling the breach, and also the passage from Luke about the woman who was healed on the Sabbath day, and how the people in power were saying, you shouldn't do this, Jesus, you are defaming the Sabbath day. And they used those two passages of scripture to build on and to show the story of what has happened in the black community. And when they were asked, telling King, you have to wait, and you wonder, why can't you wait? And it's because you've suffered too long already. Blacks have suffered too long in the country. And we have to tell our story, just like the Jews told their story about their coming out of Egypt. And they used the song, Go Down Moses, Tell Pharaoh, Let Our People Go. It was a mixture of that, and Reverend Croft sang what we call the black Negro, used to call it the Negro anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, showing how far we have come. We know we've been lifted, but then in the last verse we're asking God to lead us further. So we must tell that story, and this is why this morning I started off talking about my family, because it's a story in all of us, and all of us have not come from the same kind of families, but all of us most of us have made our way from where we were when our parents and our grandparents, all of my grandparents were slaves, were born slaves. But all people do not have the same ability, and that's what we have got to realize, that some people need more help than others. And we're just hoping. I think Dr. King, if he were here, he would be saying this kind of thing, that the schools need to be taken care of. That we still have so many segregated schools in our cities and in the countries. We have schools that are not being properly funded, and where the worst teachers are being sent.
Right.
And that's where we need the best teachers. So that's my
Okay. And we're coming down to the last few minutes of the show, so one of the things I wanted to personally hear from both of you was, having been there, the impact that it's made on you, and how you've dealt with, having actually heard his speech and having been there in person and seeing changes over the last 50 years. What are your thoughts on, just in general, having been there and the impact it's had on you, his speech?
Well, as I said, it has been an unforgettable experience, one that until it's time for me to go to my other life, I will always remember. I will be proud and thankful that I was able to attend, even at that early time in my experience of living in the United States, gradually becoming acquainted what the issues were in terms of race, and also getting to know people of all races, white people, brown people, who were marching and working along with African Americans at that time, and still do today. My husband was one of them. He went to the march in Selma, Alabama, and it was a learning experience, and one that once you learn it, you cannot forget it. And I want to continue to do is to continue to be sensitive and to work towards making this a better society for everyone.
May I just read my poem, not my poem, it's written by Langston Hughes, I Dream a World. I'm still in that feeling that this is what Martin Luther King was saying to everybody. I dream a world where no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace her paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world, I dream, where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounty of the earth, and every man is free. Where wretchedness will hang its head, and joy, like a pearl, attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world. And whenever I think of Dr. King, I think that this is actually what he was saying, and that this is something that we all need to feel, and that it can only come through nonviolence. That was his signature, nonviolence, and continuing to talk to each other and try to bring forth solutions.
And I think that's a perfect way to conclude our show today. And I want to thank both of you for coming. I don't think anything can match the the discussion from people that were actually there in person, that got to witness it firsthand. So I'd like to thank you, Lucilia, and thank you, Mabel. And with that, we're going to take a look at the last few minutes of Martin Luther King's speech and reiterate what we've heard today. So let's take a look at that, and we'll be right back.
Sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.